Welcome to Karen's HOA Nightmares. Get ready for the most outrageous, shocking, and downright hilarious tales from the world of homeowners associations. In today's story, Andrew Lance thought his retirement would be a quiet escape from the chaos of his past life as a corporate lawyer. He bought a lakeside cabin, hoping to spend his days fishing and enjoying peace by the water. However, his calm new life took a wild turn when Sarah Cruz, the president of the Homeowners Association, showed up at his property, demanding that he leave because she claimed to own the entire lake. When Andrew refused, Sarah called 911, setting off a chain of events that led him to uncover a long-hidden family secret. He owned not just the lake, but 800 acres of land, including most of the surrounding community. As Andrew navigated this shocking revelation, he found himself up against Victoria's manipulative schemes and a community caught in the crossfire. What started with a simple fishing trip turned into a battle for justice, property rights, and the future of the entire neighborhood. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, and keep up with our latest hot stories. Get off my lake now or I'm calling the police. Sarah Harrington, the HOA president, was shouting at me from my own cabin deck. This crazy Karen was demanding that I leave my lakeside property, claiming she owned the entire lake. When I refused to leave, she didn't hesitate to dial 911. The officer who arrived was visibly confused, probably wondering who calls the cops on someone standing on their own property. But little did Sarah know, what I was about to learn about this land would make her regret ever crossing me. Let me tell you how this entire situation turned upside down. Share your thoughts in the comments if you've dealt with a neighbor this insane. Let me walk you through the day that turned my peaceful retirement into the most absurd property dispute you could imagine. I'm Andrew Thompson, and at 45, I thought I had seen it all during my 20 years as a corporate lawyer. But nothing, nothing, could have prepared me for what happened when I bought a lakeside cabin to finally unwind and forget about the legal world. I found the place through an estate sale, nestled away on what I assumed was a quiet lake where no one would bother me. The whole point was to escape the stress, the deadlines, the constant corporate battles, and just have a peaceful spot to fish. I just wanted to wake up, enjoy my coffee, and cast my line into calm waters. But it seems like the universe had other plans for me. It was a Tuesday morning in early May. I was sitting on my small wooden dock with coffee in hand, enjoying a peaceful fishing session while watching the sunrise paint the sky in golden and orange streaks. The water was like glass, not a soul in sight. Exactly the kind of morning I had dreamed of during those endless nights spent in stuffy boardrooms. I was thinking, this is it, Andrew. This is happiness. I cast my line and settled back, already planning to make this my new daily ritual. The stress from my corporate career was starting to melt away, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly at peace. Then, I heard a car engine revving up the gravel road behind my cabin. It was the kind of driving that immediately puts you on edge, the kind that screams aggressive. Before I could turn around, a white BMW screeched to a halt right behind my cabin. Out stepped a woman who looked like she was born to talk to managers. She had a perfect bob haircut, a perfectly pressed outfit, and a look on her face like she had just caught me doing something horribly wrong. She marched toward my dock like she owned the place. I thought, oh great, here we go. But I'm going to stay calm. I came here for peace, not for drama. She yelled from about 50 feet away, her voice cutting through the air like a foghorn. Excuse me, this is a private community lake. You can't fish here. I turned around, still holding my coffee, and saw this woman practically vibrating with indignation. She was pointing at me like I was some sort of criminal, and it hit me. She was serious. She genuinely thought she could tell me to leave my own property. I set down my coffee and stood up, trying to remain calm. Ma'am, I'm fishing from my property shoreline. I own this cabin and the land it sits on. But she wasn't hearing any of it. No! She screamed. Yes. Screamed like a toddler throwing a tantrum. I'm Sarah Cruz, president of the Homeowners Association. I control all lake access. This is exclusive community property. She pulled out her phone and started recording, making the whole situation even more surreal. Here I was, just a guy trying to fish in peace, and this woman was treating me like I was some kind of public menace. I'm documenting this violation for legal action, she said, as if she was conducting some kind of official investigation. The whole thing would have been funny if it wasn't so completely insane. And then, she made the call that would change everything. She dialed 911 and told the dispatcher, I need police immediately. There's a trespasser refusing to leave our exclusive community amenity. The dispatcher asked if anyone was in danger, and Sarah shouted back, He's destroying our property values. Send someone now. I stood there fishing, watching this woman have a complete meltdown because I was fishing from my own dock, on my own property. She kept filming and muttering about how I built this community from nothing. I deserve respect. What was insane was how calm I stayed through it all. 20 years of handling corporate drama had taught me to keep my cool under pressure, but this was something else. This woman was so convinced she had the authority to control a lake that I was sure was a public waterway. I just kept fishing, occasionally glancing at her as she paced around my property, complaining about property values and community standards. Part of me wanted to laugh, but another part of me was genuinely curious about what kind of authority she thought she had. I mean, I dealt with power-hungry people before, but this was next-level delusion. About 20 minutes later, the police officer showed up. He looked as confused as I felt. Sarah immediately pounced on him, waving her phone around, showing him the videos she'd taken of me fishing. "Officer, this man is trespassing on private community property. He's violating HOA rules," she said. The officer looked at her, then at me, then back at her, trying to figure out what was going on. I handed him my property deed and fishing license, staying calm and polite. "Officer, I'm fishing on my own property. I bought this cabin 3 months ago, and as far as I know, the lake access has always been open to residents." The officer spent a few minutes looking at both our documents, clearly more confused by the minute. Sarah had official-looking HOA papers, and I had my legitimate property deed, clearly showing a boundary dispute. Finally, he handed everything back and said, "This looks like a property dispute, which is a civil matter. I can't arrest anyone for fishing on their own property, but you folks need to work this out yourselves." Victoria's face went red with anger. "This is unacceptable. I'll call the county and demand action," she shouted as the officer shrugged and drove off, leaving me alone with her. Afterward, I went inside to clean up, trying to process everything that had just happened. That's when I found something that would change everything, though I had no idea at the time. While going through an old trunk in the bedroom closet, I discovered family photos and documents left behind by the previous owners. Most of it was just old pictures and letters, but one faded letter caught my attention. It mentioned the Lance property, and there was a map attached. The map was mostly unreadable, but I could make out a large piece of land with a lake in the middle. Thompson, that's my family name. My great-great-grandfather had lived somewhere around here, but I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just family history stuff, nothing important. But then Sarah came back to my cabin, not done with me. She returned with a stack of official-looking notices and started taping them to my door. "Cease and desist all lake activities immediately. $50,000 fine for continued violations." I watched her through my window, thinking this woman had completely lost her mind. That's when my neighbor Gary came over, looking stressed and uneasy. "Andrew," he said quietly, "Victoria's been telling all the new buyers that this whole area is going private. She claims she controls the development rights for 200 acres around here. Thompson, landowner, 800 acres. 800 acres. I'm staring at this computer screen, trying to wrap my head around what that means. That's not just a house and a yard. That's a massive piece of property that would include the entire lake and most of the surrounding neighborhood. I'm thinking about that faded map fragment I found, and suddenly it's starting to make sense. But it needed, to be sure. So I called the genealogy expert. The expert I hired was this elderly woman who specialized in historical property records, and she was absolutely fascinated by what I'd found. She told me it would take a few weeks to verify everything, but the initial research was promising. Apparently, the Lance family had owned a huge tract-off land in this area dating back to the 1800s. And there was a good chance that the property had been divided for tax purposes, but never legally subdivided. That would mean the original deed might still be valid, which would mean I could potentially own hundreds of acres without even knowing it. It sounds crazy, but she'd seen similar cases before, especially with older properties that had been in families for generations. While I was waiting for the genealogy expert to finish her research, I started looking into Victoria's background, and what I found was disturbing. She had these secret contracts with a small local development company, and she was promising them private lake access and exclusive development rights for a project that would bring her a $1 million commission. The problem was she was selling rights that she didn't actually own. She was telling the developer that she could remove problem residents and deliver Aprivet Lake for their luxury resort project. Meanwhile, she was telling new home buyers that they were purchasing exclusive lake access properties and charging them premium prices for that privilege. The woman was running a full-scale real estate fraud operation. The really crazy part was how confident she was that she could pull this off. She had convinced herself that she had the legal authority to control the lake, and she was using that fake authority to make deals worth millions of dollars. But what she didn't know was that I was quietly building a case against her, documenting every fraudulent claim and every illegal contract. 3 weeks later, when my genealogy expert called me back, her voice was shaking with excitement. "Andrew," she said, "the Lance family deed was never properly divided. Based on my research, you might own the entire original property, but Andrew has no idea what Sarah is planning while he waits for confirmation." Echo Stories community. What's your craziest neighbor story? 3 weeks of waiting for property verification felt like the longest 3 weeks of my life. Every morning, I'd wake up and check my phone, hoping for that call from the county records office. Meanwhile, Sarah was getting more aggressive by the day. She'd hired contractors to start community improvements around the lake, which, basically, meant she was trying to physically alter the landscape to support her claims of private ownership. I'm watching bulldozers and construction equipment showing up, and I'm thinking, this woman is either completely insane or she knows something I don't. But when that call finally came from the county clerk, everything changed. "Mr. Thompson," the voice on the other end said, "I've reviewed all the historical documents with our legal team. The Lance family deed from 1847 is still legally valid, and it was never properly subdivided. Based on our analysis, you appear to own approximately 800 acres, including the entire lake area, most of the surrounding residential community, and the land where Maggie Cruz is currently conducting her development activities." I had to sit down when I heard that. 800 acres. That's not just a big backyard, that's an entire community. I owned the lake. I owned most of the houses around it. I owned the land where Sarah was building her illegal development, and I owned the property where Victoria's own house sits. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd been threatening to fine me $50,000 for fishing was actually living on my land without permission. But with great power comes great responsibility, and I realized I had a huge decision to make. I could become a landlord overnight, collecting rent from dozens of families and potentially evicting anyone I didn't like. Or I could figure out a way to use this discovery to protect the community from Victoria's fraud while doing the right thing for everyone involved. First thing I did was call Gary because I felt terrible about the position Sarah had put him in. When I explained the situation, the poor guy broke down crying. "Andrew, I can't take her money," he said. "I found out she's been lying to everyone, including the developer. She's been promising them things she doesn't actually have the right to deliver. My wife's cancer treatment is expensive, but I can't be part of this fraud." That's when I realized that Gary wasn't just a victim of Victoria's bribery. He was a decent guy who'd been backed into a corner by medical bills and a manipulative sociopath. I told him I'd help him figure out the situation with his wife's medical expenses. But first, we needed to stop Sarah before she destroyed any more lives. But Sarah wasn't going down without a fight. Somehow, she'd gotten wind of my research, and she was accelerating her timeline for the development project. She started bulldozing areas around the lake, claiming she was making emergency community improvements to prevent environmental damage. In reality, she was trying to create facts on the ground, making physical changes to the property that would support her claims of ownership and development rights. She was also becoming increasingly paranoid, convinced that everyone was conspiring against her. Here's what nobody tells you about dealing with someone who's completely lost touch with reality. It's exhausting. I mean physically, mentally, and emotionally draining. Every day, wondering what fresh hell she'd cook up next. Would it be more fake notices? More security guards? Maybe she'd start claiming I was running a meth lab out of my cabin. The unpredictability was killing me. It was like living in a psychological thriller where the villain had a homeowners association handbook. I'd see her driving around the neighborhood at all hours, taking photos of people's houses and confronting residents about their loyalty to the community. The breaking point came when I called a legitimate homeowners association meeting. I sent proper legal notices to all 50 residents, giving them the required advance notice and explaining that we needed to address serious concerns about recent HOA activities. 45 people showed up, which was the largest turnout in the community's history. The room was packed with angry residents who were finally learning about what Sarah had been doing in their name. I started by presenting evidence of the invalid emergency meeting, showing how Sarah had violated the HOA's own bylaws by holding votes without a proper quorum. But then Gary stood up and dropped the real bombshell. Sarah offered me $5,000 to lie about Andrew. Gary announced to the packed room. She wanted me to testify that he was hurting property values and that the lake restrictions were necessary for community safety. You could hear a pin drop in that room. Gary was shaking, but he continued. My wife has cancer, and we're struggling with medical bills. But I can't be part of this fraud. Victoria's been lying to all of us. Then he played the recordings he'd made of his conversations with Victoria, where she clearly outlined her plan to manipulate the HOA vote and push through her development project without proper authorization. The room erupted in angry voices, with residents shouting questions and demanding answers. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She stood up and launched into this incredible meltdown that I'll never forget. "This is a conspiracy," she screamed, pointing at me and Gary. "You're all trying to destroy me. I built this community from nothing. I've worked for years to increase property values and create something special here." She was red-faced and shaking, completely losing control in front of the entire neighborhood. "Those documents are fake. That man," she pointed at me, "is just a troublemaker who wants to ruin everything we've built." The residents were staring at her in shock, watching their HOA president have a complete public breakdown. But I hadn't even revealed the biggest secret yet. Finally, when the room calmed down a bit, I stood up and said the words that changed everything. "There's something else you all need to know," I announced, feeling the weight of 45 pairs of eyes on me. "Something about who actually owns this land." The room went dead silent. Victoria's face went pale, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew something big was coming, but she didn't know what. I've spent the last 3 weeks working with genealogy experts and county records officials, and I've discovered that my family's original property deed from 1847 is still legally valid. That deed covers this entire area. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd were immediate, but I wasn't finished, which means that not only do I own the lake that Sarah has been trying to control, but I also own most of the land in this community, including the area where she's been conducting her illegal development project. What Andrew is about to reveal will change everything. But will it destroy the community or save it? Have you ever discovered something that completely changed your perspective? Tell us what happened. The silence in that room was deafening. 45 people, staring at me, trying to process what I just told them. I owned 800 acres. I owned their lake. I owned most of their neighborhood. And I owned the land where Sarah had been running her million-dollar fraud operation. You could literally see the wheels turning in people's heads as they realized what this meant. Some looked scared, probably wondering if I was going to evict them. Others looked relieved, like they finally understood why Victoria's claim had never made sense. But Sarah looked like she was about to have a heart attack. "That's impossible!" she shrieked, jumping up from her chair. "Those documents are fake. I've been developing this area for years. I know the law." But I was ready for her reaction. I pulled out the official county verification documents, the genealogy expert's report, and copies of the original 1847 deed. "Victoria, according to the county records office, the Lance family property was never legally subdivided. It was divided for tax purposes to make the bills manageable, but the original deed remained intact. That's why the property boundaries have always been confusing, because legally it's still one massive piece of land." I spread the documents out on the table, and people started crowding around to see them. The original property map was incredible. It showed the entire lake, the surrounding forest, and most of what was now the residential community. Victoria's breakdown was spectacular to watch. She went through all the classic stages: denial, anger, bargaining, and finally just pure panic. "This is a conspiracy," she screamed. "You're all trying to destroy me. I built this community. I deserve respect." She was pointing at everyone in the room, her voice getting higher and more hysterical with each word. "I've been working with developers. I have contracts. I have rights." But Gary, bless him, stood up and delivered the final blow. "Victoria, you don't have any right to sell. You never did. You've been committing fraud, and now everyone knows it." The look on her face when she realized that her million-all development deal was worthless was almost sad. Almost. That's when the small local developer showed up, and let me tell you, he was not happy. This guy had put down $100,000 based on Victoria's promises of exclusive lake access and development rights. When he walked into that meeting and saw the county documents proving that Sarah had been lying about everything, he lost his mind. "You promised me private lake access," he yelled at Victoria. "You said you could deliver exclusive development rights. I've got investors breathing down my neck, and now you're telling me this was all fake." Sarah tried to blame everyone else. Me, Gary, the county records office, even the genealogy expert, but the damage was done. The developer was already talking about fraud charges and breach of contract lawsuits. But here's the thing that really got to me. The fear in my neighbors' eyes. These were good people who'd bought their homes in good faith. And now they were looking at me like I was some kind of feudal lord who might decide to evict them on a whim. I realized I had to address their concerns immediately. Look, everyone, I said, standing up and trying to project calm authority. I want to be very clear about something. I didn't know about this inheritance when I bought my cabin. I came here for the same reason you did, to have a peaceful home near a beautiful lake. The last thing I want is to be anyone's landlord or to disrupt your lives. I could see some people relaxing, but others still looked worried. My fight is with Sarah and her fraud operation, not with any of you. The community reaction was mixed, which I completely understood. Put yourself in their shoes for a second. You wake up one morning and some stranger drops a bombshell that turns your entire world upside down. I don't blame them for being confused, scared, or even angry. Hell, if I were them, I'd probably be wondering if this Andrew guy was just another scammer trying to pull a fast one. Trust is a fragile thing, and Sarah had shattered it for everyone. Some people were angry that they'd been lied to about the exclusive lake access they'd paid premium prices for. Others were worried about their property values and what this revelation meant for their investments. A few residents were actually relieved because they'd never liked Victoria's authoritarian approach to community management anyway. But everyone wanted to know the same thing. What was I going to do with 800 acres of land and the power to control an entire community? It was the biggest decision I'd ever faced, and I honestly didn't know the answer. Gary stepped up and offered to help me figure out the legal implications. As a local lawyer, he understood the complexity of the situation better than anyone. Andrew, he said, you have several options here. You could assert your property rights and become a traditional landlord. You could sell the land to a developer. You could subdivide it properly and sell individual lots to the current residents. Or, he paused, looking thoughtful, you could donate the land to the county for public use. That would preserve the community while ensuring that no one else can pull a Sarah-style fraud operation in the future. The idea of donating the land was intriguing, but it was also terrifying. We're talking about millions of dollars in potential value. Meanwhile, Victoria was making increasingly desperate moves. She tried to destroy evidence by shredding documents in her office. She attempted to declare bankruptcy to avoid the fraud charges. She even tried to convince the developer that I was Theon committing fraud, claiming that my documents were forgeries designed to steal her legitimate development project. But it was too late. The county had already opened an investigation into her activities, and the state attorney general's office was reviewing the evidence for potential criminal charges. Victoria's house of cards was collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The really tragic part was watching someone dig themselves deeper and deeper into a hole. Sarah had convinced herself that she was the victim in all of this, that everyone was conspiring against her success. She couldn't accept that she'd been committing fraud, that she'd been lying to people and stealing their money. Even when faced with undeniable evidence, she continued to insist that she was right and everyone else was wrong. It was like watching someone choose to live in a fantasy world rather than face reality. But reality has a way of catching up with people, and Victoria's reality was about to come crashing down. The sheriff arrived the next morning with a warrant for Victoria's arrest: real estate fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy charges. I watched from my cabin window as they led her away in handcuffs, still screaming about conspiracies and fake documents. The woman who called 911 on me for phishing was being arrested on land that I actually owned. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But as satisfying as it was to see justice served, I still had the biggest decision of my life to make. What would you do with 800 acres and the power to change everything? But Andrew still faces the biggest decision of his life. What would you do with 800 acres and the power to change everything? Echo Stories family. What's the right choice when you suddenly have power over an entire community? The morning Sarah got arrested was surreal. I'm drinking my coffee and watching the sunrise over the lake. My lake, I still couldn't get used to that. When I see the sheriff's cars pulling up to her house, 3 police vehicles, lights flashing, and a crowd of neighbors gathering to watch the show. Sarah came out screaming, of course, because that woman couldn't do anything quietly. This is harassment. This is a conspiracy. I'm being targeted for protecting property values, but the charges were serious. Multiple counts of fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy. 6 families had been cheated out of a total of $150,000, and that was just what they could prove. The prosecutor told me later that some victims might never get their money back because Sarah had already spent most of it on her lifestyle and legal fees. The civil lawsuits started piling up immediately. The developer sued Victoria for $500,000 in breach of contract damages, The families who'd paid premium prices for fake exclusive lake access filed a class action lawsuit. Even the homeowners association sued her for abuse of authority and misrepresentation. The problem was Victoria's assets could only cover about 60% of the total damages. Her house, her car, her bank accounts. Even if they liquidated everything, there wasn't enough money to make everyone whole. Some of those families were going to eat the loss, and that really bothered me. These were good people who trusted the wrong person and paid the price for it. But the criminal case was moving forward, and that's what really mattered. The state prosecutor was taking this seriously because Victoria's fraud operation had been so systematic and well documented. She'd created fake contracts, made false promises to multiple parties, and used her position as HOA president to legitimize her scam. The evidence was overwhelming. Recorded conversations, forged documents, bank records showing where the money went. Victoria's defense strategy seemed to denying everything and claiming she was the victim of a vast conspiracy, which wasn't exactly compelling to a jury. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the aftermath of my own revelation. The media had picked up the story, and suddenly I was the guy who discovered he owned 800 acres while trying to fish in peace. Local news stations were calling me for interviews, and the story was spreading on social media with headlines like, "Man discovers he owns entire lake while fighting HOA Karen." It was flattering in a way, but also overwhelming. I'd moved to this cabin to escape attention, and now I was the center of a viral story about property rights and HOA abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. The hardest part was the decision I had to make about the land. For weeks, I couldn't sleep, walking around the property at night and trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. I could become rich overnight by selling to developers, or by asserting my rights as a landlord. 800 acres in a desirable lakefront location could be worth millions. But every time I thought about that option, I remembered why I'd moved here in the first place. I wanted peace, not the responsibility of being a landlord to dozens of families. I wanted to fish and work on my woodworking hobby, not manage a real estate empire. Gary became my unofficial advisor during this period, helping me understand the legal options and the implications of each choice. His wife's cancer treatment was going well, and he was incredibly grateful that I'd helped him avoid getting caught up in Victoria's fraud scheme. "Andrew," he said one evening as we sat by the lake, "you have a chance to do something really special here. You could set a precedent for how communities should actually work." That's when he explained the idea of donating the land to the county for public use. It would preserve the community exactly as it was, ensure that the lake remained accessible to everyone, and prevent any future Sarah-style fraud operations. Plus, the tax benefits would be substantial. The more I thought about it, the more the donation idea made sense. I'd get significant tax savings, about $30,000 per year, while ensuring that no one would have to worry about being evicted or manipulated by power-hungry HO presidents. The lake would become a public recreation area, open to everyone forever. The community would be preserved, and I'd still have my cabin and my peaceful retirement. It felt like the right thing to do. But it was also terrifying to give up that much potential wealth. We're talking about millions of dollars that I was considering just giving away. Victoria's sentencing hearing was scheduled for a month after her arrest, and I decided to attend. I wanted to see justice served, but I also wanted to understand how someone could go so far down the wrong path. The courtroom was packed with her victims' families who'd lost their savings, the developer who'd been scammed, and community members who'd been manipulated and lied to. Sarah showed up in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. But when it came time for her to speak, she still couldn't accept responsibility. "I was just protecting property values," she told the judge. "I built this community from nothing. I deserve respect, not persecution." The judge wasn't buying it. "Miss Cruz, you systematically defrauded multiple families and businesses. You abused a position of trust for personal gain. You showed no remorse and continued to lie even after being caught. 3 years in state prison, plus restitution of $400,000. Money that Sarah would probably never be able to fully repay." As they led her away, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Multiple families had lost money they couldn't afford to lose. A community had been torn apart by lease and manipulation, and one woman had destroyed her entire life through greed and poor choices. But 3 years in prison can change a person. The question is, has it changed Victoria? Prison either breaks people or transforms them. What do you think happens to someone who loses everything they built through their own greed? 3 years later, I'm sitting in the same courtroom, but this time it's for Victoria's parole hearing. The woman who walks in looks nothing like the screaming, entitled HOA president I dealt with years ago. Prison had aged her, humbled her, and apparently given her time to think about what she'd done. She'd been working in the prison laundry, attending counseling sessions, and slowly paying back what she could to her victims. When the parole board asked her about her crimes, she didn't make excuses or blame anyone else. "I was wrong," she said simply. "I let greed and power corrupt me. I hurt good people who trusted me, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life." But I wasn't there to support her parole. I was there to represent the community that was still healing from her fraud. "Your Honor," I told the parole board, "while I appreciate that Miss Cruz may have changed, the damage she caused is still being felt. Some of her victims never got their money back. Some had to sell their homes because of the financial strain. The community is stronger now, but we're still dealing with the consequences of her action." The parole board listened carefully, but ultimately decided that Sarah had shown genuine remorse and had been a model prisoner. She was released after serving 2 and 1/2 years of her 3-year sentence. Meanwhile, I'd made my decision about the land, and it was the best choice I've ever made. I donated all 800 acres to the county, creating the Lance Lake Public Recreation Area. The tax benefits were substantial. I saved about $30,000 per year, but more importantly, I'd preserved the community and ensured that the lake would remain accessible to everyone forever. The donation ceremony was incredible. Hundreds of people showed up, including families from all over the county, who'd been coming to the lake for generations. The county commissioner called it one of the most generous acts of public service in our region's history. Gary had become the new HOA president, and he'd transformed the organization into a model of transparency and accountability. All meetings were public, all financial records were open to residents, and all decisions required proper notice and genuine community input. He'd learned from his mistake with Victoria, and he was determined to make sure that no one could ever manipulate the system again. His wife's cancer treatment had been successful, and their marriage was stronger than ever. I learned that money isn't worth compromising your integrity. He told me one evening as we fished together, "You saved me from making a terrible mistake." The community transformation was remarkable. Property values had actually increased after Victoria's arrest because people wanted to live in a place with honest leadership and genuine community spirit. The lake became a popular destination for families throughout the county, and local businesses thrived from the increased tourism. Every year we held Lance Lake Day, a community festival that drew thousands of visitors. I received a county medal of honor for my extraordinary service to the public good. But honestly, the real reward was seeing kids playing on the same lake where Sarah had once tried to ban fishing. Victoria's life after prison was a study in consequences. She couldn't work in real estate anymore due to her criminal record, so she took a job at a retail store, slowly paying back what she could to her victims. She'd lost her house, her car, her savings, and her reputation. But she'd also gained something that she'd never had before: self-awareness. She occasionally visited the lake on weekends, sitting quietly on a bench and watching families enjoy the water. I saw her there once, and she gave me a small wave. I nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was recognition that people can change. The legal precedent from our case became a model for other communities dealing with HOA abuse. Gary started a legal practice specializing in property rights and HOA reform, helping other residents fight back against corrupt leadership. He'd speak at conferences and workshops, telling our story and teaching people how to recognize and prevent the kind of fraud that Sarah had perpetrated. The key, he'd always say, is transparency. When everything is done in the open, it's much harder for bad actors to manipulate the system. But the real success story was the community itself. We'd survived a crisis that could have torn us apart, and we'd emerged stronger and more unified than ever. The lake that Sarah had tried to control was now a place where everyone was welcome. The neighborhood that she'd tried to manipulate was now a model of democratic governance, and the people she'd tried to exploit were now advocates for transparency and accountability. It was proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply doing the right thing. 5 years after Victoria's arrest, I achieved exactly what I'd set out to do when I bought that cabin. I wake up every morning, make coffee, and fish in peace. My woodworking hobby has turned into a small business, and I'm genuinely happy. The lake is always busy with families and visitors, but that just makes it more alive and vibrant. I'd rather share this beautiful place with everyone than keep it to myself. Sometimes the best power is the power you give away. This story started with a simple 911 call and ended with a man owning 800 acres. Echo Stories viewers, what's the wildest plot twist that ever happened in your real life? 5 years have passed since Victoria's arrest, and Lance Lake has become everything I dreamed it could be when I first bought my cabin. Every morning I wake up to the sound of families setting up for a day of fishing, kids laughing as they jump off the dock, and the gentle splash of canoes and kayaks exploring the shoreline. The lake that one woman tried to control for her own profit is now a place where everyone feels welcome. I'm sitting on my deck right now watching a father teach his daughter how to cast a fishing line, and I'm reminded of why I made the decision to give this land to the public. Some things are too beautiful to own. The The community has thrived in ways I never expected. Lance Lake Day has become the biggest annual festival in the county, drawing thousands of visitors who come for the fishing tournaments, craft fairs, and live music. Local businesses have flourished because of the increased tourism, and the economic impact has been incredible. But more importantly, we've created a culture of transparency and accountability that has spread to their communities. Gary's legal practice specializes in helping neighborhoods fight HOA abuse, and he's become a nationally recognized expert on property rights and community governance. His wife's cancer has been in remission for 4 years now, and they're more in love than ever. Victoria's story took a surprising turn about 3 years after her release. She'd been working at a retail store, living in a small apartment, and slowly paying back what she could to her victims. But then she started volunteering at the community center, helping with literacy programs and food drives. At first, people were skeptical. Was this another manipulation? Another scheme? But over time, her actions spoke louder than her words. She never asked for recognition or tried to rehabilitate her image. She just quietly helped people. And slowly, some members of the community began to forgive her. Not everyone and not completely, but enough to show that redemption is possible for people who genuinely change. The legal impact of our case has been significant. The Lance Lake precedent is now cited in property law textbooks as an example of how historical deed research can resolve modern disputes. Law schools use our story to teach about fraud prevention and the importance of due diligence in real estate transactions. The genealogy expert who helped me verify my inheritance has become something of a celebrity in her field, appearing on documentaries about property rights and historical land ownership. She always jokes that she's never seen a case where an old map fragment led to someone owning 800 acres. But she's proud of the role she played in exposing Victoria's fraud. But the real success story is what happened to the victims of Victoria's scam. While some never got their full money back, the community came together to help them in other ways. We organized fundraisers, provided legal assistance, and created support networks for families who'd been hurt by the fraud. The developer who'd been scammed ended up partnering with the county on legitimate projects that benefited the entire region. Gary helped several families restructure their mortgages and find financial relief. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was community justice. People taking care of each other when the system fell short. My own life has found the perfect balance between solitude and community. I still live in the same cabin, still fish every morning, and still work on my woodworking projects in the afternoon. But now I'm also involved in the community in ways I never expected. I teach property rights workshops, help resolve neighbor disputes, and serve on the County Parks Commission. I found that having given away my accidental wealth, I'm richer than I ever was as a corporate lawyer. The satisfaction of seeing families enjoy the lake, knowing that I helped preserve it for future generations, is worth more than any bank account. Sarah and I have never had a direct conversation about what happened, but we've acknowledged each other in small ways over the years. She still visits the lake occasionally, usually sitting alone on a bench and watching the activity around her. Sometimes I see her feeding ducks or picking up litter that visitors have left behind. It's a strange kind of closure. Not the dramatic confrontation you might expect, but a quiet understanding that we've both moved on from who we were during that conflict. She's paying for her crimes, and I'm enjoying the peace I always wanted. The kids in the neighborhood love hearing the story of how their lake was saved from the mean lady who tried to take it away. They don't understand all the legal complexities, but they grasp the basic moral of the story. Sometimes doing the right thing is more important than making money. Last week, a group of 10-year-olds asked me to tell them the Karen story again. And as I watched their faces light up when I got to the part about discovering I owned 800 acres, I realized that this tale has become part of the local folklore. It's a story about standing up to bullies, about communities coming together, and about the power of doing what's right even when it's not easy. Looking back, I can't imagine how different my life would have been if I'd made different choices. What if I'd decided to be a landlord and collected rent from all my neighbors? What if I'd sold the land to developers and walked away with millions? What if I'd let Sarah intimidate me into giving up my fishing rights? Every decision led to this moment, sitting by a lake full of happy families, knowing that I played a small part in preserving something beautiful for future generations. Sometimes the best revenge really is just being right, and sometimes the greatest wealth is the wealth you give away. The sun is setting over Lance Lake as I finish this story, and I can see Sarah sitting on her usual bench about a H100 red yard away. She's watching a family pack up their fishing gear after a successful day on the water. Tomorrow morning I'll wake up, make my coffee, and cast my line into the same water where this whole adventure started. But now, instead of fishing in solitude, I'll be sharing the lake with everyone who wants to enjoy it. And that, I think, is exactly how it should be. And that's how a 911 call about fishing led to me discovering I owned 800 acres of county land, and learning that giving it away was the richest thing I could do. Listen here, sometimes the people who scream the loudest about their authority are the ones who have the least.